Hey everybody, this is going to be a quick video about two approaches to, sorry my wife is laughing at me. Is it good? Apparently my videos aren't quick enough. You know what, I'm leaving that in. Anyway, so this is going to be a quick video, hopefully quick, about two approaches to psychological science, and that is the evolutionary approach and the standard approach, all right, or the standard social science model. So very quickly, these two approaches address psychological questions from a very different perspective. Evolutionary psychology is very misunderstood, all right, and so I'm going to come back to that here in a second. First, I'm going to talk about the standard science model. The standard science model is very Lockean, and what I mean by that is it very much endorses this idea that human social behavior is a consequence of learning. So if you remember, Locke had this idea of tabula rasa, this idea of a blank slate, the idea that a person is shaped solely by their experiences and that they don't carry anything carry over anything from their parents except what they've learned. And certainly given a lot of the, motives and hopes and aspirations of the social sciences, and I think, well, and in fact it's documented, of the sciences in general, taking this approach that everything we do and all of our social behavior is the product of learning is appealing, because it means that all we have to do is change society and culture and we can fundamentally reshape people. And because of those goals, and again, those goals are great goals, right? They tend to view evolutionary psychology in very deterministic ways. And so what I mean by that is that the standard social science model tends to assume that everything from evolutionary psychology is attempting to identify things that are biological, and people tend to misassume that if it's biological, then it's going to happen. And people often also misassume that if it's biological, then it's good. And neither of those things are true. All right, neither of those assumptions are true. Just because something's biological does not mean it's good. All right, and just because something, we inherited some tendency to behave in a certain way does not mean that we're guaranteed to do it. All right, so that standard social science model, its approach leads it to misrepresent evolutionary psychology and misunderstand it. So then what is the actual approach that evolutionary psychology has? Well, it is a standard biological approach to behavior, just like any biological approach. It's neither, it assumes that yes, we do have certain instinctual drives, certain psychological mechanisms that are shaped by the history of our species, just like every other animal on the planet does. All right, so it's really based in this idea that humans are just like every other animal on the planet. We are shaped by our environments and our species history. Evolutionary psychology then does not assume, however, that just because we've inherited an instinctual drive, that instinctual drive will always predict our behavior and it's unchangeable. All right, the drives themselves, the psychological mechanisms that we inherited, because all of us as a species have those psychological mechanisms, yeah, those are pretty constant. But whether or not they actually get used is a different matter altogether. All right, with the standard biological model, yes, we inherit a certain set of genes, but just because we inherit that genetic makeup does not mean that every aspect of our genetic makeup is going to get expressed. Interactions with the environment, such as nutrition, exposure to light, these interactions with the environment change what genes get turned on and what don't. All right. Well, evolutionary psychology approaches human behavior the exact same way. That we have these psychological mechanisms that have been shaped by our evolutionary history, but our experiences change which ones get turned on, all right, and which ones don't. Also, each of those psychological mechanisms seem to be very sensitive to variations in the contexts. So one analogy that Jonathan Haidt uses, which I think is a great analogy, is you can think of our evolved psychological mechanisms as a first draft of a book. All right. The environment then edits the book. It doesn't completely rewrite it from the first page. It edits it. And so after many, many drafts of editing, each individual book can seem very different. So you can think of, and maybe this will help understand how evolutionary psychology approaches behavior. You can think of what we are born with, our instinctual drives, as that first draft. All right. You can think of them as our default. Okay. And if nothing in our context leads us to disuse a certain part of that default setting or to change it, then it proceeds on and it works as it would by default. But if something in the environment triggers an edit, then that default setting gets turned off and it doesn't end up influencing our human behavior. So I want to talk about this dichotomy in the context of one of the debates happening currently in social psychology in the study of human mating preferences. So you have the standard evolutionary psychology model, which argues that there are sex differences, that males and females have different costs and benefits to choosing a mate, and those costs and benefits dictate specific mating preferences. And so, one of the biological theories for sex differences in parental investment comes from Trivers. And so his theory of parental investment argues that because that the sex that is most invested in the offspring will be more discriminating in their offspring, in their mate selection, whereas the sex that is least discriminating that the sexes that is least invested in offspring will be not only less discriminating in their mate selection, but they'll also be more competitive with members of the opposite sex, members of the same sex for access to the opposite sex. And so in 95% of mammalian species, of 95% of mammals, and this includes humans, females are more biologically invested in the offspring. Even if they give up the child at birth, they're more biologically invested because gestation takes more caloric investment from them. It prevents them from being able to reproduce again. I've known several pregnant ladies, and I swear pregnancy is hard. It is hard, all right? For psychological reasons, for physical reasons, it's hard. It's very demanding. Now, certainly I imagine their spouses would say, well, it's pretty demanding on me too, but come on, the caloric investment, the psychological strain, the stress on the body, for these reasons alone, and these aren't all of the biological reasons why women are more invested in their offspring. For these reasons alone, females are more invested in their offspring. Again, even if they give up the child at birth, they're more invested in their offspring. Now, according to Trivers, this reason alone is enough to make women more discriminating. Now, another difference is that because women tend to be, not just human women, but all females tend to be more investing in their offspring. For example, in most mammalian species, it's the female that is responsible for feeding the offspring, all right, especially in their earlier years. So more caloric investment, right? So the females tend to be more invested in their offspring. But because they're having to devote a huge chunk of their time to caring for the offspring, they don't have as much time, because there's only so much time in the day. They don't have enough time to also accumulate resources. And so for the majority of mammalian species, and for humans for the majority of the species and for the majority of our history, females, because they take care of the offspring more often, they don't have as much time to contribute to resource acquisition for them to acquire resources, food, protection, shelter for themselves and their offspring. And so we get a certain degree of and of course I'm blanking on it, but basically women then look to mates who can provide those resources. And so because women then look to the opposite sex, look to mates for the provision of those resources, it puts a premium on the ability to provide resources, ultimately causing men to compete in how able they are to provide resources so that they can get, men want better and better mates, and so they compete in the domain that females want. All right, and so one of the standard, according to the evolutionary model, one of the standard preference differences is that females want mates who are good resource providers, or able to, they have greater access to resources, whereas men tend to not care about that as much. So women, according to the evolutionary model, have the problem of parental investment. They're more invested in their offspring, so their time is cut up because they have to commit so much time to tending to their offspring, so they need a partner that can help by providing resources. Well, men don't have the same problem. All right, men don't have that same problem of parental investment. They have a problem of parental certainty. You know, females are always 100% certain that they are the mothers of their children. They're always 100% certain of that. Men, there is always the potential for some question about their paternity. So over our history as a species, and this isn't just true for humans, it's true for again, the majority of mammalian species, men have the problem of parental certainty. They're not as certain about their own paternity. And so if they're going to, not all mammalian species are high investors, are high male investors. Human males invest quite a bit in their partners. But because we invest quite a bit in our partners, that problem of parental certainty becomes more impactful. Because if a male invests all of his time and resources in a particular female, then the chances of him getting what we call cuckolded, her cheating on him with another man, and then he ends up raising another man's child, the chances of that go up, especially if he commits all of his time. Also, even if she doesn't cheat on him, if he commits all of his time and energy to one individual, then the chances, if that relationship doesn't lead to successful reproduction, then the guy's kind of out of luck, right? So to solve that parental certainty issue, men tend to focus more on cues that tell them, hey, this female is going to be able to successfully give me, we're going to be able to have we're going to successfully be able to have a healthy offspring. All right, and so they look for cues of that. And one cue to health is physical attraction. People who are healthier tend to be seen physically attractive, and that's true across the planet. All right, so one of the big sex differences based on these evolutionary principles is that females tend to look for men with access to resources, and men, sorry, let me restate that. Women tend to look for men with access to resources more than men care about access to resources in their mates. And men tend to care more about physical attractiveness in their mates more than women do. Now, quite a bit of research shows that women care a lot about how physically attractive their mates are. And in some places, just as much. All right. But from the standard social science model, we have alternative explanations for this gender difference, specifically in the form of the biosocial model. Now, the biosocial model, which is proposed by Eagley and Wood and some others have written about it, is this idea that, well, the reason you have these differences in mating preferences between men and women is not because of any biological reason, but instead it's because of the social structures of society. Basically, yes, the biosocial model does acknowledge that there are sex differences. Men tend to be bigger, tend to be stronger, but it argues that because of these, we do see role segregation. So men and women do perform different functions, but then power gets ascribed to the male roles. And so because of this, females don't get access to those roles unless they go through a mate. I mean, they don't get access to that power unless they go through a mate. And so the biosocial argument for the gender differences is that women prefer access to resources because that's the only way they can get power, or at least in most societies. And Eagley and colleagues have found that in countries where gender equality is higher, you see those sex differences in mating preferences get reduced and sometimes seem to almost go away. And the two sides have been going back and forth about this constantly. But keep in mind that it's not necessarily a dichotomy, because remember what I said about evolutionary psychology. We don't necessarily, and I say we because I consider myself an evolutionary psychologist, we don't necessarily say that these biological predictors of behavior are deterministic. We don't think that here's a biological drive and it's always going to happen. Remember what I said is that you inherit the first draft of your instincts, I guess, or your behaviors, and then situations, the context can turn it off or on. And research suggests that, yes, on average across the planet, and this was just replicated in, I think the paper was published, no, it was published this year in 2020 with, I think, I forget how many countries. I think there are 45 different countries, many thousands of participants. Again, the sex differences are there even when you control for gender equality. But so you've got these default settings, right, which lead to those gender differences in mating preferences. But when certain contexts change, it edits the book, turns a psychological mechanism off, or allows it to run. So, for example, some research suggesting that when women already have a lot of access to resources, their preference for men with high access to resources begins to drop, and their preference for physically attractive men seems to go up. Well, of course, remember I said quite a bit of research says that women do care about physical attractiveness. Well, if the context makes that, again, earlier talking about the logic of the fact that, you know, women tend to be more invested, and so they don't have as much time to commit to finding resources, and so they need a partner to help with that. Well, if they already have the resources, the need for a partner to help with that drops. All right. And that's exactly what we see. So again, evolutionary psychology doesn't assume that, oh, you inherit these biological dispositions and they're always going to happen no matter what the context is. That's not what evolutionary psychology assumes at all. Rather, just like biology, you inherit genetics, the environment and your experiences turn some genes on or off. Same thing. You inherit a set of psychological mechanisms, and the context activate some of those psychological mechanisms, turn some off, or lets the default system run. All right. And so I think even though right now it seems like you've got the standard social science model, talking about attraction here, even though it seems like the standard social science model as personified in the biosocial model is saying something very different than the evolutionary model, I don't think they necessarily are. It's just two camps that are trying to push, the way they've learned about things. But the true evolutionary approach of evolutionary psychology says, hey guys, you're focusing on different things, but nothing about what either of you are saying is incompatible. All right. So I bring this up just because a lot of social psych textbooks are written by people who are still who are trained in the standard social science model, and they're seeing all this evidence come out about evolutionary psychology, and so they're having to deal with it. They're having to incorporate it into their knowledge set, but a lot of them are resistant to do it, and they're not comfortable with doing it because it seems contradictory to the standard social science model. And again, there are fundamental differences between the evolutionary model and the standard social science model. But once the actual evolutionary psychology model is not deterministic, and indeed suggests that context the environment can turn on and turn off different mechanisms. So, as I was saying, the reason I bring this up is because if you read, a lot of social psychology textbooks, you feel this kind of, well, there's evidence for evolutionary psychology, but really that can be explained with this. And so it's still that you still in the textbooks, you still often get this either or situation. But what I'm telling you is that evolutionary psychology, even though the fundamental approach to human behavior is different than the traditional social science model, it can account for and embrace a lot, if not most, of the findings and theories put forward by the standard social science model. So I guess basically to sum up, there is some disagreement, but it's not an either-or situation. More than likely, and certainly it's been my experience, there's some middle ground. All right, guys, that's it for this video. I guess my wife was right. It wasn't as brief as I had hoped. All right, guys. But if you have any questions, send them my way. If not, then I will see you later.